And as far as I know, you're also interested in barefoot running. Can you explain a
Yeah.
little bit about what that is?
Well, that's basically how Xero Shoes evolved. So I got back into sprinting 14 years ago when I was 45, and I was getting injured pretty much constantly. And a friend of mine who's a world champion cross country runner, he suggested that I try running barefoot so I could see if I learned anything about what might have been causing my injuries. And to make a longer story very short, what I learned from getting out of big padded motion controlled shoes and feeling my feet on the ground was why I was getting injured. I basically could tell that I had a form problem that was causing my injuries. And more importantly, I naturally found a way to change that form, to change my gait. And my injuries went away. And the reason that it happened is pretty simple. When you're out of padded, motion controlled, elevated heel, arch supporting shoes, when you have your bare feet on the ground, doing it wrong hurts. Doing it right feels great. I mean, like fun. You can spot a barefoot runner from 100 yards away. They have this weird look on their face. I think it's called smiling. And so that was the beginning. It was just getting out of regular shoes and experiencing what human beings have been doing for thousands and thousands of years. It's typically running barefoot. But barefoot alone is a little challenging. There's places you can't get into, not without an argument. So speaking of things that humans have been doing for thousands of years, I made a pair of sandals that actually, there's an archaeological dig where they found a pair of sandals from about 10,000 years ago. And the pair that I first made looked a lot like those. The gist, something to protect your foot, something to hold that protection on your foot. That's really it. And that was just a goofy hobby of mine. Now, there are a lot of people who call themselves barefoot runners who've never actually had their bare feet on the ground. And so, which I get, but it's not quite the same. And maybe we'll get into that a bit later, just what the distinction is. But suffice it to say, I just wanted that natural movement experience. I wanted to have my feet bend and move and flex and get feedback from the ground. And with the sandals that I made, just a thin bit of rubber, some cord from a local hardware store, that's what allowed me to do that. And then the short version of how that became Xero Shoes was I was making sandals for friends and friends of friends and other runners. And one day a guy said that he was writing a book on barefoot running. And if I treated this sandal making hobby like a business and had a website, he'd put me in the book. So we started because of the barefoot running movement, because I was part of that. But when we were on the show, we were getting calls from people who didn't know anything about barefoot running. They weren't even runners. They just would call us and say, "Oh my God, I'm so glad you're doing what you're doing. I hate shoes," or my feet don't fit normal shoes. Or they had all these reasons where it was just the general populace telling us that they believed in and wanted what we were doing. And it gave us a lot of confidence that there was a much bigger market than we had anticipated. And we've continued to prove that. I mean, Mark Cuban, his objection to us was that what we were doing was a bubble and it was going to crash. Or there's even some industry analysts who say the whole barefoot running minimalist movement, had a big rise and then it crashed. And it's totally not true. What it did, it had a really big rise, and then that rise slowed down as big companies got in and got out. But for our company and for a couple of our competitors who've been around for that same time, our businesses have just continued to grow year after year after year after year, because more and more people experience, who have nothing to do with running or are into barefoot, but they just experience the benefits of natural movement through what we do. And that's a powerful and an addictive, frankly, thing that happens.
Yeah, I think me personally, for example, I'm not a runner, but I like sports, but I don't particularly run. But I have feet and I'd like to be healthy.
Yeah.
And I know that there is some kind of like advantages to barefoot walking or even not even running, just walking. Can you explain a little bit more about the health effects of barefoot running and walking or natural movement, how it affects, and if you don't do it, like what happens to your body, and if you move naturally, what will then change potentially?
Yeah, you've already sort of set the stage perfectly. So yes, I can. Well, let me preface this by saying you have a quarter of the bones and joints of your entire body in your feet and ankles. Clearly, that's so they can move. That's why joints exist. And that movement that all those bones and joints allow your feet and ankles to do is about giving you balance and agility and mobility. And if you don't let your feet do their job, bending, moving, flexing, all those functions try unsuccessfully to move upstream into other joints, your knee, your hip, your back, all the way up to your neck even. And so that's part one. Part two, you have more nerve endings in the soles of your feet than anywhere but your fingertips and your lips. So that's also not an accident. This is to tell your brain what your feet are feeling, whether what you're stepping on or in, so your brain knows how to control your body. In fact, some of those signals don't even go to your brain. They just go to the base of your spinal cord and right back down in a reflex arc. So like if you step on something sharp, you don't need to think, oh, maybe I should lift my foot off the ground. It reflexively happens. So your feet are they're a miracle. And the simplest thing I can say is, it's a case of use it or lose it. We all know this. There's research behind natural movement that I call the stupidest research ever done, because we have to do research to prove things like using your body is better than not using your body. So the research shows, for example, that if you walk in a pair of shoes like Xero Shoes, and they could have done it barefoot, but a lot of the research is done in truly minimalist shoes because they know most people aren't going to walk around barefoot, at least not most of the time. So just walking in a pair of truly minimalist shoes, and we can talk about that distinction in a bit too, just by walking, you build intrinsic foot muscle strength as much as doing an actual foot exercise program. Conversely, pun intended, there's research showing that if you put arch support in the shoes of healthy individuals, they lose up to 17% of the strength and muscle mass in their feet in as little as 12 weeks. And that shouldn't be surprising, because if you're putting support in your arch is supposed to move. Bones and joints, they move. If you put your arm in a cast, it gets weaker over time. If you put your foot in a cast, it gets weaker over time. So that's the fundamental thing. Now, there's a couple of other pieces. A truly minimalist shoe, a shoe designed to simulate being barefoot, will have a wider toe box. If you look at most shoes, I'm going to hold one up for you to see. It's got a pointy toe box. Your foot is not pointy. Or if it is, it shouldn't be. It's because you shoved it into shoes like that. So if you think about dropping and doing push-ups, you don't squeeze your fingers together. You spread your fingers apart.
Yeah.
It gives you more strength and more balance. Your feet are supposed to do the same thing. There's another component with shoes. They tend to elevate your heel, which there's a long story about why that happened. The idea is that it's providing cushioning. It actually doesn't. The research is very clear that cushioning actually, the more cushioning you put in the shoe, the more you end up keeping your leg straight and putting force through your joints instead of using your muscles, ligaments, and tendons as springs and shock absorbers and joint protectors. And so that's another piece of the puzzle that's problematic. Where all of this leads fundamentally, there was actually just an article in the Washington Post about a week ago with comments from Dr. Irene Davis at Harvard and Jay DeSherry, who's a research physical therapist, talking about how it's beneficial for kids to be in truly minimalist shoes so their feet don't develop basically deformities, and so that they have proper development of the musculature and the nervous system that your feet are supposed to be part of. And for elderly people, the problem is all those things about shoes, squeeze your toes, don't let your foot bend and move, you don't let your foot feel, can lead to balance problems, which lead to falls, hip breaks, and death in many people, including my dad about 6 years ago. So they were talking in this article about how truly minimalist shoes from the research can be beneficial to kids and the elderly, and of course everyone in between. So if you think about it, the simple thing is, again, use it or lose it. If you aren't giving your brain the information that it needs, it literally shuts down certain sections of what it's supposed to be doing. So you can't move properly. You can't balance properly. You can't adjust to the ground properly. If your shoe is too high off the ground, the higher you get off the ground, the harder it is to balance. We know that's an issue as well. If you squeeze your toes together, that can cause bunions. If you don't let your foot move properly, the thing with adding arch support is your arch is supposed to be engaged. Like, think about doing bicep curls. You know, you're weakest when your arm is straight. You're strongest when your arm is at about 90 degrees. There's an analogous thing like that with your foot. If you don't let your arch engage properly, it's like having your arm fully extended, and that's when it's weak. And that typically in normal shoes is happening at a time when you need your foot to be strong. So the plantar fascia and the calf, they're working hard against an immovable force, against this arch support. And so that can create things like plantar fasciitis. So the simplest thing I can say is, if you want to go to places where people's feet tend to be really, really healthy, go to places where they don't have indoor plumbing. Go to places where they don't wear padded, arch supporting, motion controlled, elevated heel, pointy toed shoes. And you'll see that they tend to have a distinct lack of podiatrists. If you read the book Born to Run, it talks about the Tarahumara Indians who live in Mexico, who run in sandals made of strips of used tire just strapped to their feet with some leather. They don't have problems running enjoyably until they're in their 70s or 80s. They don't have the kind of injuries that runners get now. Runners, since the advent of the modern athletic shoe, which is from about 1970. I mean, here's the crazy thing. What you and I are talking about with minimalist footwear, we're not the intervention. That's the way human footwear has been for 99.5% of human history. The modern athletic shoe is the intervention. And since its invention, on average, 50% of runners and 80% of marathoners get injured every year. And that hasn't changed since the 70s, despite all the, quote, advances in technology and footwear. You know, there's a lot of incentive for these companies to make a shoe that actually helps people, and they just haven't done it because fundamentally, this idea, padded shoes, elevated heels, arch support, motion control, squeeze your toe box, just doesn't do that. In fact, Irene Davis's research shows that it does the opposite. It can cause the problems they claim to be curing.
If you enjoyed this episode, hit the subscribe button and never miss an episode of Svencast again.